She was a black widow with 2 children, her very existence a testament to loss and an unspoken burden, collapsing at the white rancher's door. He, a man weathered by the sun and silence, looked once upon her broken form, and the 2 small faces clinging to her, his gaze unreadable, and merely said, "Get in." This was not an invitation of warmth, but a guttural command, a stark doorway into a world where salvation was earned in the crucible of unspoken truths and simmering prejudice. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust, an omnipresent phantom in the sun-baked air, seemed to cling to her very bones, a fine grit that had permeated every fiber of her being since the last shard of hope had splintered away. Sarah, a name that once held the gentle lilt of a lullaby, now felt like a curse on her parched tongue, synonymous with the crushing weight of an unbearable past. Her children, Isaac and Lily, barely more than shadows themselves, clung to her skirts, their small hands like desperate anchors against the vast, indifferent world. The journey had stripped them bare, leaving behind only the raw, aching impulse to survive. Every rasping breath was a testament to a resilience born of desperation, a grim defiance against the fate that had shadowed her since the fateful day a fever had claimed her husband, leaving her orphaned of love and branded by a community's suspicion. She was a black widow, not by choice or by design, but by the cruel twist of circumstances and the whispers that followed her like hungry vultures. The ranch house, a squat, unyielding silhouette against the bruised orange of the fading sky, loomed before them, an intimidating bastion of solitude. Its weathered planks seemed to absorb the last vestiges of warmth from the dying day, exuding an aura of hardened resilience, much like the man who inhabited it. Sarah's legs, numb and unresponsive, finally gave way, her knees buckling beneath her, sending her tumbling onto the porch. The impact jarred her teeth, but the pain was a dull whisper compared to the inferno of fear and exhaustion that raged within. Isaac, with a whimper, buried his face into her side, while Lily, the younger, merely stared with wide, unblinking eyes at the imposing doorway. The wooden boards felt rough against her cheek, smelling of old wood and something else, something undefinable, perhaps the faint scent of hope or the bitter tang of despair. A moment stretched, thick and suffocating, until the sound of a heavy door creaking open shattered the oppressive silence. A man stood framed in the doorway, a figure carved from the very land he worked, stoic, broad-shouldered, his face a canvas of deep-set lines, and a gaze that seemed to pierce through the weariness to the very core of her soul. Elias Thorne. The name was a rumor, a whisper of a recluse, a man who kept to himself and his acres of unforgiving soil. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, swept over her collapsed form, lingered for a fraction of a second on the fragile bodies of her children, and then settled back on her, cold and assessing. No pity softened the hard lines of his mouth. No question escaped his lips. There was only the raw, unadorned statement of his presence. And then, a single, guttural command, devoid of warmth or welcome: "Get in." It was a word that offered no comfort, only the stark reality of shelter. A brutal honesty that promised nothing but what was absolutely necessary for survival. Sarah, too weak to question, too desperate to refuse, began to drag herself forward, pulling her children with her, into the unknown. The interior of the ranch house offered little solace from the biting chill of the evening, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. It was a place built for utility, not comfort, its sparse furnishings reflecting the solitary nature of its inhabitant. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the grimy window panes, illuminating the rough-hewn floorboards and the looming shadows that clung to the corners of the room. Elias Thorne simply gestured towards a narrow cot in the corner, a silent command that brooked no argument. Sarah, her muscles screaming in protest, guided her children towards it, their small bodies slumping onto the rough wool blanket with an exhausted sigh. The scent of wood smoke and stale air hung heavy, mingling with the faint, unsettling odor of something indefinable, perhaps the ghost of countless forgotten meals or the lingering echoes of a solitary life. Elias remained a silent sentinel, his presence a physical weight in the small room. He moved without sound, a man accustomed to the quiet hum of his own thoughts, his every action precise and economical. Sarah watched him from the periphery of her vision, a tightening knot of apprehension in her chest. His face, etched with the unforgiving lines of labor and solitude, revealed nothing. Was he a savior, or merely another in the long line of tormentors life had sent her way? The question clawed at her, an insistent whisper against the roar of her exhaustion. She pulled Isaac and Lily closer, their fragile warmth the only anchor in this cold, unfamiliar world. Their vulnerability was a constant, sharp ache, a reminder of the immense burden she carried, a weight that sometimes felt too heavy to bear. As the hours crawled by, marked only by the shifting light outside and the quiet breaths of her sleeping children, Sarah found herself dissecting every creak of the floorboards, every rustle from the next room. The silence was broken only by the mournful hoot of an owl outside and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote, sounds that seemed to echo the emptiness she felt within. Sleep, a distant luxury, eluded her. Her mind, a tireless loom, replayed fragments of the past, the feverish coughs of her beloved Samuel, the widening eyes of their neighbors, their judgment a silent, suffocating shroud. They had called her cursed, a black widow, not because of her grief, but because of the color of her skin and the abruptness of her husband's passing. The injustice of it still burned, a smoldering ember in her heart. She was a survivor, yes, but also a pariah, chased from one place to another by the relentless tide of suspicion and prejudice. Elias, in the pre-dawn hours, brought out a tin plate of coarse bread and dried meat. He set it down without a word, his eyes once again sweeping over her, an inscrutable gaze that seemed to penetrate her very being. The food was meager, but it was sustenance, a stark reminder of their dependence. Sarah's pride, a tattered flag, fluttered in the face of her hunger, but the needs of her children outweighed any personal indignation. She tore off pieces for Isaac and Lily first, watching their small, grateful bites, a flicker of fierce maternal love momentarily eclipsing the pervasive fear. This was their new reality, a tenuous existence tethered to the whims of a silent, formidable stranger. The shadows of her past, however, stretched long and cold, even within the rough confines of Elias Thorne's home, threatening to engulf any fragile hope that dared to sprout. The rhythm of life on Elias Thorne's ranch was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, a harsh cadence of labor and stark necessity. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle, each one a testament to the unforgiving nature of the land and the quiet struggle for existence. Sarah, refusing to be a burden, quickly sought out work. Her hands, though calloused from hardship, possessed a quiet competence. She mended torn garments, cleaned the sparse living quarters, and tended to the small garden patch behind the house, coaxing reluctant life from the dry soil. Her efforts were met with silence from Elias, neither praise nor criticism escaping his tightly drawn lips. Yet, in his lack of complaint, she found a strange unspoken acceptance, a silent agreement that her presence was, for now, tolerated. The air between them remained thick with unspoken words, a tangible weight of apprehension and curiosity. Elias was a man of routines, his movements precise and predictable, like the swing of his axe against a log or the measured tread of his boots across the fields. He rarely spoke, his communication often reduced to grunts or gestures, his eyes doing the talking, observant, often distant, sometimes shadowed by an emotion Sarah couldn't quite decipher. She, in turn, spoke only when necessary, her voice soft, careful not to disturb the fragile truce that existed between them. The children, initially timid as frightened sparrows, slowly began to find their voices, their laughter, a startling, alien sound in the quiet house, sometimes eliciting a brief, almost imperceptible tilt of Elias's head, a fleeting acknowledgement. One blistering afternoon, as Sarah struggled with a stubborn patch of weeds, her back aching and sweat stinging her eyes, Elias appeared beside her. He knelt, not offering help, but merely observing her technique. Then, without a word, he took the crude hoe from her hands, demonstrating a more efficient grip, a subtle adjustment of the angle. His fingers, strong and calloused, brushed hers for a fleeting second, sending a jolt of unexpected sensation through her. He straightened, handed the hoe back, and walked away, leaving Sarah to ponder the silent lesson, a flicker of something akin to gratitude warming her chest. It was a small mercy, a moment of unsolicited guidance that chipped away at the formidable wall he had erected around himself. hinting at a hidden seam of humanity beneath the gruff exterior. Yet, the undercurrent of societal prejudice remained, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their tenuous existence. Elias's decision to take in a black woman and her children was an anomaly in this isolated, racially charged landscape. Sarah often caught glimpses of the wary glances of the few, scattered neighbors who occasionally passed by, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and outright suspicion. They were an oddity, a defiance of the unspoken rules of their time, and such defiance rarely went unchallenged. She knew her presence here was a risk, not just for herself and her children, but for Elias as well. The very ground they stood on felt precarious, a fragile sanctuary built on the shifting sands of an unpredictable world, threatened by the unseen currents of hatred and intolerance that flowed through the veins of society. This was not a haven. It was a temporary reprieve, and Sarah understood, with a chilling clarity, that the fragile peace they had found could shatter at any moment. The seasons shifted, the sun's relentless heat giving way to cooler, crisper mornings, painting the vast plains in hues of russet and gold. With the changing weather, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred within the ranch house, a loosening of the taut strings of tension that had initially bound them. Isaac, emboldened by the quiet acceptance, began to follow Elias on his rounds, his small hand sometimes reaching out to grasp the rough fabric of the rancher's trousers, a gesture of innocent trust that Elias, surprisingly, did not swat away. Lily, the youngest, with her boundless energy and infectious giggle, often found her way into the solitary man's orbit, leaving behind small, crudely drawn pictures on his workbench or offering him wildflowers she had painstakingly gathered from the fields. These small intrusions into his carefully guarded solitude seemed to soften the rigid lines of Elias's face, if only for fleeting moments. Sarah witnessed these interactions with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The rancher, a man who had seemed carved from granite, possessed a hidden vein of tenderness, revealed only in the presence of her children. He would sometimes offer Isaac a piece of dried fruit, or let Lily perch on his knee as he mended tack, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he explained the workings of a buckle. These were not grand gestures, but small, cumulative acts of kindness that chipped away at Sarah's deep-seated distrust, revealing layers beneath the gruff exterior. She found herself, in turn, occasionally sharing snippets of her own thoughts, small observations about the weather or the meager harvest. And Elias would listen, his silence now feeling less like judgment and more like a receptive presence. A fragile bridge, built of quiet respect and shared vulnerability, began to span the chasm of their differences. Yet, the world beyond their isolated haven remained a volatile, unpredictable force. The increasing frequency of riders passing by, their faces obscured by the dust they kicked up, carried an unspoken menace. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across the porch, reached Sarah's ears from the occasional peddler or supply wagon that dared to venture near the ranch. They spoke of escalating tensions in the nearby towns, of resentment simmering and occasionally boiling over, of land disputes turning violent, and of the tightening grip of racial prejudice. The sight of a lone rider watching the ranch from a distant ridge, his silhouette stark against the fading light, sent a tremor of icy fear down Sarah's spine. It was a silent warning, a predatory gaze that made her realize their fragile peace was constantly under surveillance, a trespass against the established order. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air, a premonition of looming storm. Sarah found herself constantly vigilant, her senses heightened, every shadow a potential harbinger of danger. She knew that Elias's decision to harbor them, a black family, was not merely an act of charity, but a defiant stand in a world that demanded conformity. This defiance, she realized, made them all targets. The growing connection between her and Elias, the nascent sense of belonging the children felt, only served to amplify the stakes. This hard-won tranquility felt like a mirage, shimmering on the edge of a brutal reality, a fragile sanctuary that could be shattered by the slightest shift in the volatile currents of human malice. The ranch, once a distant, intimidating silhouette, now felt like a fort under siege, its defenses tenuous, its inhabitants living on borrowed time. The scent of burning leaves, carried on a gust of wind, always brought it back. The memory, a jagged shard of glass, pierced through Sarah's hard-won tranquility, pulling her back to the day the world had tilted on its axis. It wasn't just the fever that had claimed Samuel, her strong, gentle husband. It was the chilling indifference of the townsfolk, the outright refusal of the white doctor to cross the tracks into their part of town, claiming other, more urgent patients. Samuel had withered, his breath growing shallow, his skin burning beneath her frantic, helpless touch. The pain of his passing was compounded by the searing injustice of it, the bitter knowledge that his life had been deemed less worthy. The whispers had started then, hushed at first, then growing louder, transforming grief into accusation. "She's cursed," they'd murmured, their eyes wide with superstitious fear. "Every man she's close to, gone. A black widow." The first man, her father, had died years before in a logging accident, a tragedy of the woods. The second, her eldest brother, had been taken by consumption. Now Samuel. 3 men, all gone. The illogical fear had taken root in the minds of the ignorant, nurtured by the seeds of prejudice already sown deep within the soil of their community. She had been branded, her very existence a harbinger of ill fortune. The weight of that label, heavy and suffocating, had driven her from their home, forced her to wander, a pariah with 2 hungry mouths to feed, until she collapsed at Elias Thorne's door. The memory still burned, a phantom limb of injustice, reminding her of the cruelty of a world quick to condemn and slow to understand. The title, Black Widow, wasn't just a descriptor of her marital status. It was a brand, a mark of societal ostracization, an enforced solitude that chilled her to the bone. Elias, too, carried his own silent burdens. He would sometimes sit by the dying embers of the hearth, a bottle of cheap whiskey cradled in his calloused hands, his gaze distant, lost in the swirling patterns of the smoke. Sarah had pieced together fragments of his story from the occasional terse word or the rare, unguarded glance. He had once had a family, a wife and child, taken by some unnamed tragedy years ago. The details were vague, shrouded in a protective veil of silence, but the lingering grief was palpable, a phantom presence that permeated the very walls of the house. He was a man who understood loss, perhaps better than anyone, and it was this shared wound, this unspoken empathy born of mutual suffering, that had allowed him to extend a hand, however gruffly, to Sarah and her children. His decision to shelter them had not been made lightly. He grappled with it every day, the precariousness of their situation a constant hum beneath the surface of his stoic demeanor. He knew the risks, the rising tide of suspicion from his neighbors, the potential for outright violence. His solitude, once a choice, was now a fragile shield. He had seen the way people looked at Sarah, the thinly veiled contempt, the fear. He had seen enough injustice in his own life to recognize its insidious creep. He was a man of the land, pragmatic and unyielding, but beneath the hardened exterior, a moral compass, long dormant, had begun to stir. The children's laughter, the quiet competence of Sarah, they were chipping away at the walls he had built around himself. The question remained, could he stand against the rising tide of prejudice, or would the fear and the community's judgment finally break him? The answer, he knew, would determine not only his fate but theirs. The crisp air of autumn gave way to the biting cold of winter, and with it, a new, more tangible threat began to circle the ranch. The isolated sanctuary that Elias had unwittingly provided became a beacon for scrutiny, drawing the hostile attention of those who saw its very existence as an affront. One blustery afternoon, as Sarah hung laundry on the line, the wind whipping at her skirts, she noticed them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the stark, skeletal trees of the distant ridge. They were not passing through, they were watching. Their presence, a silent, predatory gaze, sent a shiver of primal fear through her, an icy premonition of danger. Their faces were obscured by the distance, but their intent was clear, a palpable weight pressing down on the isolated ranch. Elias, sensing the shift in the wind, tightened his routines, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He spent more time in the barn, cleaning his old rifle, its polished wood gleaming ominously in the dim light. The children, sensing the unspoken tension, grew quieter, their laughter replaced by hushed whispers and solemn faces. The fragile peace they had cultivated was crumbling under the mounting pressure of external forces. The visits from the few local men who dared to approach became increasingly pointed, their questions laced with thinly veiled accusations. "Heard you got some new hands, Elias." One had sneered, his gaze sweeping pointedly towards the house where Sarah moved within. "Ain't natural. A man like you, taking on strays." The word hung in the air, heavy with insult and disdain. The true crisis erupted on a frigid evening, the kind of night where the wind howled like a banshee, clawing at the windows and rattling the very foundations of the house. A sudden, insistent pounding echoed from the front door, harsh and demanding, shattering the deceptive calm of their evening meal. Elias, his face a mask of grim resolve, rose without a word, taking his rifle from its pegs. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She pulled Isaac and Lily close, their small bodies trembling against hers. The rough voices from outside, slurred and angry, pierced the thin walls, speaking of rightful ownership, of trouble, and unnatural alliances. They demanded entry, their threats growing louder, more menacing, fueled by the intoxicating blend of alcohol and righteous indignation. Elias opened the door just wide enough to reveal his formidable silhouette, the rifle held casually, yet firmly, in his hands. The frigid air rushed in, carrying with it the reek of whiskey and unbridled malice. "What do you want?" Elias's voice, low and gravelly, cut through the clamor, his gaze unflinching as it met the belligerent faces of the men. They were the typical figures of societal prejudice, bloated by their own self-importance, their small-mindedness amplified by the collective bravado of a mob. One of them, a hulking man named Jed, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with drunken fury. "We come for what's yours, Thorne," he slurred. "Or what you're holdin' that ain't rightly yours. This ain't your fight." His words were a direct challenge, an overt declaration of war against the silent defiance Elias had embodied. The cold truth was laid bare. This wasn't just about Sarah. It was about power, about challenging the very notion of a man choosing compassion over conformity. The air crackled with a dangerous energy, the silence that followed Jed's words more terrifying than any roar. The air in the doorway crackled with a tension so palpable it felt like physical pain. Elias Thorne, rifle still held steady, faced the mob, his features a mask of stoic defiance. Jed, emboldened by the whiskey sloshing in his belly and the backing of his cohorts, took another staggering step forward, his voice rising in a sneering challenge. "This ain't just about her, Thorne. We heard about the land. Your father. He never paid his debts right. And now, you're bringing more trouble onto it? This land, it belongs to the rightful owners, men who work it without." He trailed off, his gaze flicking contemptuously towards the interior of the house where Sarah and the children huddled in the shadows. The true motive, a venomous brew of racial hatred and opportunistic greed, began to surface, a far more insidious beast than simple prejudice. Elias's jaw tightened, a muscle clenching visibly. The old wound, long buried beneath layers of silence and hard labor, had been savagely ripped open. The debt, his father's failed ventures, a legacy of shame, and a decades-long struggle to keep the ranch afloat. This wasn't just about Sarah. It was about the ranch itself, the only home Elias had ever known, the very ground he had fought for, acre by arduous acre, since he was a boy. He knew these men, these predatory vultures, had been circling for years, waiting for any sign of weakness, any justification to seize what they believed was theirs. Sarah's presence, the defiance it represented, was merely the spark that had ignited their long-simmering avarice. He had inadvertently drawn a target on his back, and now they were here to claim their prize. Sarah, listening from the shadows, felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This wasn't just about her being Black Widow, a cursed woman. This was about something deeper, something rooted in the land itself, a struggle for dominion that predated her arrival. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had sought refuge from one kind of persecution, only to unwittingly lead Elias into another. Guilt, sharp and sudden, pierced through her fear. She had been a burden, a catalyst for this confrontation. bringing the very danger she sought to escape directly to her reluctant protector. As Jed lunged forward, perhaps intending to disarm Elias or simply to assert his dominance, Elias did not flinch. His voice when it came was not a shout, but a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the howling wind. "Get off my land." The simple words carried the weight of generations, of a primal ownership, a defiance born of desperation and deep-rooted belonging. The shotgun, though still pointed downwards, seemed to vibrate with a contained power. For a fleeting second, the tension wavered, the mob hesitating, confronted by the unyielding resolve of a solitary man. But Jed, fueled by drink and a lifetime of unchecked entitlement, stumbled forward again, his hand reaching for Elias's arm. And in that crucial moment, a sharp, metallic click echoed through the porch. Elias, with a practiced, almost imperceptible movement, had brought the rifle up, the cold glint of its barrel now leveled directly at Jed's chest. The air froze, the wind's howl seeming to die in their throats. It was a silent ultimatum, a stark choice between retreat and bloodshed. The flickering light from the lantern inside cast grotesque shadows on the faces of the mob, revealing their sudden, stark fear. This wasn't just talk. This was a man pushed to the brink, defending his home, his sanctuary, and the vulnerable lives he had, against all odds, chosen to protect. The quiet, stoic rancher had finally shown his teeth, and the confrontation had moved beyond words into the perilous realm of absolute consequence. The sudden, chilling click of the rifle bolt sent a jolt of stark terror through the drunken mob. Jed froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning fear. The cold barrel of the firearm gleamed ominously, a stark pronouncement of Elias Thorne's unyielding resolve. The bluster drained from the men's faces, replaced by the grim realization that this quiet rancher, long dismissed as a harmless recluse, was prepared to defend his home to the death. The wind, still howling, seemed to carry the very breath from their lungs, leaving only the deafening silence of a moment, poised on the edge of irreversible violence. Sarah, witnessing this from the shadowed doorway, felt her own heart throb painfully against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat urging her to flee, even as her feet were rooted to the spot by a horrifying fascination. "This land is mine." Elias's voice cut through the silence. No longer a rumble, but a steel-edged declaration. "And what's inside is under my protection." His gaze, burning with a contained fury, swept across each man, daring them to challenge his words. The implication was clear. Sarah and her children were no longer merely strays. They were part of his dominion, bound to him by an unwritten pact of sanctuary. This was not just about defending property. It was about defending a nascent humanity, a fragile connection that had blossomed amidst the barren landscape of their lives. Elias, the man who had lived in isolated stoicism, was finally confronting the ghosts of his past, the societal pressures, and the deep-seated prejudices that sought to strip him of his land and his newfound purpose. Jed, his bravado crumbling, stammered, "Thorne, now wait a minute. We just wanted to talk." The words were hollow, ringing with a pathetic desperation. The facade of righteous indignation had fractured, revealing the raw fear beneath. The mob, sensing the shift in their leader, began to shuffle uneasily, their collective strength dissipating under the weight of Elias's unwavering resolve. It was then, in that crucial breath of suspended time, that Lily, drawn by the commotion, whimpered softly from behind Sarah, her small, frightened voice a fragile thread in the tapestry of tension. The sound, innocent and vulnerable, seemed to pierce the tense standoff, a stark reminder of the fragile lives caught in this volatile crucible. Elias's gaze flickered, softening almost imperceptibly as it landed on the small girl. The sight of her fear, the vulnerability embodied in her tiny frame, seemed to reaffirm his purpose. His hand tightened on the rifle, not in preparation to fire, but as if drawing strength from the very act of holding it. He was not just a rancher defending his land. He was a protector, a reluctant guardian forged in the fires of shared hardship. The air hung heavy with the unspoken questions. Would he truly shed blood? Would they dare to cross that line? The answers lay in the trembling balance of the moment. Jed, seeing the flicker of determination in Elias's eyes, the quiet strength that belied his usual reserve, knew he had miscalculated. The rancher was not just defending his land, he was defending an inviolable moral boundary. A guttural curse escaped Jed's lips, a sound of defeat. He turned abruptly, stumbling off the porch, his followers scrambling behind him, their retreat hastened by the cold, silent defiance of Elias Thorne. The confrontation had ended, not with a bang, but with the chilling echo of a moral victory, purchased at the precipice of absolute consequence. The silence that descended upon the ranch after the men's hasty retreat was not a peaceful one, but a heavy, echoing void, filled with the ghosts of shouted threats and the lingering scent of fear. Elias lowered the rifle, its cold metal a familiar weight in his hands, his knuckles white against the dark wood. His shoulders, which had seemed so impossibly broad moments before, now carried the heavy burden of consequence, sagging slightly with the draining of adrenaline. He stood on the porch for a long time, staring out into the impenetrable darkness, listening to the wind's mournful lament, perhaps watching for any lingering shadows, or simply processing the raw intensity of the confrontation. Sarah, from the doorway, observed him, a complex swirl of emotions churning within her: relief, gratitude, and a profound, aching realization of the debt she now owed, not just for shelter, but for life itself. The children, their initial terror subsiding, slowly crept from behind Sarah, their small hands clutching at her skirts. Lily, ever the curious one, peered out cautiously at the empty porch, then back at Elias, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. Isaac, more perceptive, simply stared at the rancher, a silent question in his gaze, perhaps sensing the monumental shift that had just occurred. The battle had been won, but the war, Sarah knew, was far from over. The mob had retreated, but their malice, their prejudice, and their avarice would linger, a persistent threat on the edges of their hard-won peace. The very act of Elias defending them, of choosing to protect her and her children against his own kind, against the societal norms of the time, had irrevocably altered their dynamic. In the days that followed, a new kind of unspoken communication settled between Sarah and Elias. The previous silence had been a barrier. This one was a bridge. His eyes, once distant and unreadable, now held a glint of shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the shared peril they had faced. He began to speak more often, though his words were still sparse, offering practical advice about the farm, or sometimes simple observations about the weather. He would ask about the children's lessons, or comment on Sarah's mending, small gestures that chipped away at the formidable wall of his solitude. She, in turn, felt a loosening of the knot of apprehension that had been coiled in her chest for so long. She saw him not just as a gruff protector, but as a deeply flawed man who, when faced with an existential choice, had chosen compassion over conformity, humanity over hatred. The outside world, however, did not forget. The occasional riders still passed, but their glances now held a mixture of resentment and grudging respect, a wary acknowledgement of Elias Thorne's unexpected resolve. The ranch became a whispered legend, a place where the old rules had been bent, perhaps even broken. Sarah knew they would never truly be safe from the long shadow of prejudice, that the label of Black Widow and the color of her skin would always precede her in the eyes of many. But here, on this land, protected by a man who had chosen to stand against the tide, she found a fragile yet potent sense of belonging. The hope that bloomed was not a wild, unbridled joy, but the robust, tenacious sprout, pushing through the cracked earth of their harsh reality, promising the possibility of a future, however uncertain. The seasons turned again, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of green and gold, then muted whites and grays, and then the burgeoning promise of spring. With each cycle, the ranch, once a place of stark solitude, slowly transformed, imbued with the quiet life of a growing family. The raw wounds of the confrontation with Jed and his men never fully healed, the scars remaining as a testament to the brutal realities of their world, but they had faded, allowing a new kind of resilience to take root. The ranch became a fortress of resilience, its walls built not just of timber and stone, but of unspoken understanding and hard-won trust. Elias Thorne, once the solitary rancher, had inadvertently become the quiet patriarch of a most unconventional family. His gruff exterior remained, a fundamental part of his character, yet beneath it pulsed a steady, quiet current of affection for the children, and a deep, abiding respect for Sarah. He taught Isaac how to mend fences and ride the old mare, his large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones with surprising gentleness. Lily, still full of boundless energy, often coerced him into impromptu games of hide-and-seek, her laughter echoing through the previously silent corridors of his life. Sarah, no longer just a refugee, became an indispensable partner, her quiet strength and unwavering dedication cementing her place not just in the household, but in the very fabric of the ranch's existence. They were a family, not by blood, but by the shared crucible of hardship and the defiant choice to stand together against a hostile world. The whispers of the Black Widow never entirely vanished, nor did the occasional wary glance from a passing stranger. Sarah carried her past, the burden of loss and undeserved accusation, as a permanent part of her identity. Yet here, on this land, under Elias's quiet protection, the label had lost its sting. It was simply a part of her story, a dark chapter from which she had emerged, bruised but unbroken. The bitter irony of her situation, that a man who had lost his own family had offered sanctuary to hers, was a profound and constant reminder of the unpredictable nature of fate and the unexpected wellsprings of human kindness. The fear still lingered, a low hum beneath the surface of their peace, for they knew the world outside remained unforgiving. But hope, a fragile, hard-earned beacon, now shone brightly. It was not the naive optimism of innocence, but the robust, tenacious hope of survivors. It was in the rhythmic thud of Elias's boots on the porch each morning, in the children's laughter carried on the wind, in the quiet companionship Sarah found in her daily tasks. The ranch, once a symbol of Elias's solitude, had become a testament to unexpected connection, a quiet defiance against the forces of prejudice and despair. Their story, etched into the very soil, was a powerful, if unspoken, declaration that even in the darkest of times, and against the most entrenched biases, human connection, forged in the crucible of shared struggle, could blossom into a profound and enduring testament to the enduring power of compassion. They had found their sanctuary, not in isolation, but in the fierce, protective embrace of an unlikely family, built on the foundations of courage, and the simple, profound act of saying, "Get in."